Welcome to the Victoria Rumble Room, a show that endeavors to bring the important issues to your screen every week. All about Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, the globe, and across the globe and across all the way to his Saanich bunker is the Croatian sensation himself, the co-host with the most, John Jurisic.
Host with the most. Oh man, I can't wait for the compilation show. I cannot wait for the compilation show. Big show this week, solemn show this week. Of course, we're doing this around a Remembrance Day. So always retrospective, always thoughtful. So there's many things to look forward to here. The Coho is back. Wow, that's fantastic. Flights gradually moving back to a regular schedule at Victoria Airport. Feels like life is maybe coming back a little bit normal. So coming up in a few minutes, we're talking to Geoff Dickson, CEO of the Victoria Airport Authority. How are things different when you travel? Will we ever get back to normal? Well, we'll hear. Can't wait to speak to Geoff about these things.
Looking forward to talking to Geoff. And you're right, John, this is a very important week, a week of remembrance for the men and women who have served our country and made the ultimate sacrifices in some cases. And on the 11th day, the 11th hour of the 11th month, so many Canadians, so many Victorians turn out, thousands of people turn out in cenotaphs across the country to remember. And I know that there are parades across the country as well. Here's a look at a couple of recent parades on the streets of Greater Victoria.
You know, Robin, I think what's really important to me around so many important things around Remembrance Day is seeing young people turning up at these events, so that we can honor the veterans, remember those who perished in battle, gave their lives so that we would have better lives. And very important that young people keep this flame alive. We have a lot to be thankful for, so much. Helping us, reminding us about that is retired Colonel Jamie Hammond. We spoke to just a few months ago around the Canadian withdrawal from Kabul. Colonel Hammond served in Afghanistan. We want to hear his thoughts on the importance of Remembrance Day. So let's zoom him in.
First thing that runs through my mind over the years is how much it's changed, how much Canadians pay more and more attention. You know, in the 1970s and 80s, Remembrance Day was almost like an intimate sort of ceremony. You know, the guards would march, all that would happen, but the crowd was much smaller than it is in the past, 5-10 years, or since probably, the operations in Afghanistan. So that's one, is how much more I feel as someone who has military experience, I feel welcomed, by society. And so I think that's one really important thing. I've often reflected on, why do we go to these things? And, obviously there's sadness for personal loss. So there are people there whose grandfather, whose father, whose loved one, whose husband was lost in one of these wars, whether it's First World War, Second World War, Korea, peacekeeping, or Afghanistan. So there's that. But the reasons I think that everyone goes to these is, one is to be inspired. And we feel by being a little bit closer to those who gave all. And we talk about that in sports, and we talk about it in business and things, give it all, baby, all that kind of stuff. The reality is these people really did, and it's not a metaphor. They gave everything for some cause. And you can be cynical, you can question the politicians and why, they were there in the first place. But on an individual basis, those people who lost their lives, they gave everything for something they believed in, whether it was Queen and Country, whether it was helping Afghans, whether it was for their buddies. They gave everything for something. And that, I think, inspires all of us a little bit in our own way. And so I think that's one reason we go. Another one is belonging, feeling like we belong to something greater than ourselves.
Just a final thought on what Jamie Hammond just said. It's just so important that we all try to remember the tragedy and sacrifice of war. We learn very important lessons from history. My degree from UVic is in history. I have a personal connection to this kind of learning. And history keeps this annual ceremony alive.
Absolutely, John. Well said. And history is such an important topic in our lives. And I want to touch on one other important history story that's certainly been hitting the news over the last few days. And that concerns the Royal BC Museum and the announcement that they will be closing the third floor very soon to redesign the Indigenous interpretive area. Now, they want to remove and reimagine the settler area as well, with its models reflecting the building of railways, towns, mines, areas to pan gold, ranching, fishing, forestry. And what we're hearing is the museum wants to re-emphasize certain aspects of our provincial history and de-emphasize our so-called colonialist past. And in the face of this, I voice a word of caution. The Royal BC Museum is always reinventing itself. This is appropriate. History is changing all the time. Our understanding of history, our context around it. And keeping that in mind, I think it's incredibly important that our Indigenous people have a real say in the exhibit at the museum, far more input than they've had in the past in telling their story, using their strong oral tradition to help them on this way. They'll ensure that the story is fully told, both the good and the bad, no doubt covering things like the residential school situation, and of course, talking about the suppression of Indigenous culture in our province. No argument on this. However, I suggest, why should we be throwing out also the culture of millions of people, millions of British Columbians who also live on this land today, the so-called settlers and their descendants? After so many years, they also deserve to have their story told. So sure, we can change the interpretation, we can change the exhibit, perhaps the narrative shifts at the BC Museum, but we still need to tell everyone's history to be fair and to really inspire British Columbians to go. The museums, after all, is everyone's to share and learn from.
Wow, well said, Robin. Well said. Such thoughtful reaction to what I think will be a very emotional reaction to what's happening down at the museum. We hope that the First Nations feel listened to and respected. We want them to be part of looking back and going forward. Boy, this will be one that I'm going to be very interested to see what happens for the future of the third floor of the Royal BC Museum. Time will tell, and I'm sure we'll report on it. All right, time to swing the pendulum a bit now. Look forward to how we're going to be traveling. This undertone of COVID, one of the many, many impacts is the impact on travel and how we're not traveling. Such an important part of who all of us are. People with double vaccinations, thank goodness, can now get a national vaccine passport and drive across the US border. They can climb on board the Coho to Port Angeles, which just recently started up again after 18 months of inactivity. The Victoria International Airport is really opening up. A lot more flights to a lot more places. This travel piece of who we are as humanity is so mission critical, to feeling good and to feeling normal. So let's talk about air travel. Right from the source, the president and CEO of the Victoria Airport Authority. Let's zoom in, Geoff Dickson.
Now, joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room from the Victoria International Airport is our special guest, Geoff Dickson. And Geoff, glad to see you've safely landed. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
And Geoff, right off the top, there's a big conference going on in Glasgow, the COP conference, all about global warming and our future and trying to reach new standards for pollution. And a lot of talk about the fact that the delegates and the politicians who all flew back and forth to Scotland all were flying in jets that were emitting all this air pollution, and they're talking about trying to pull back on that and do something about air travel. I would think this can't come at a worse time for your industry, which is trying to now pull itself back.
I can tell you that the aviation industry is taking it incredibly seriously. It's actually, I believe, the first industry to declare carbon neutrality by 2050. And so, you step back and look at, well, what exactly is the contribution to the footprint? Right now, it's 3% of all sort of pre-pandemic fuels or carbon that's going into the atmosphere. And I think it's important that the industry step back and look for alternative fuels and look in electrification, look at different composite materials for aircraft. And, we have our part to play in the airport world too. We're actually going to try and be carbon neutral by 2030.
So Geoff, I'd like to take the viewpoint here of the common person. Okay, not many folks get to speak to the CEO of the airport authority, and so the sense that maybe things are getting a little bit better. I've waited 2 years to travel. Man, I'd love to go to Edmonton for a hockey game. Okay, don't even know where to start. I don't even know sort of what kind of protocols that I have to cover off. Who do I have to pay? How safe is it in this incubated environment? Tell us some stuff, really pretty simple stuff, likely from your position. But for those of us who haven't been in the airport for now almost 2 years, a little bit scary.
Yeah, it's and I can understand the confusion because it is evolving with the regulators, Transport Canada. Almost in real time, but effectively, what you need to know right now, if you're going to travel out of Victoria International Airport, you need to be double vaccinated. Mm-hmm. So you need to have proof of that. So you probably have access to the BC Services app, and what you should do is link to the Pan-Canadian app.
Okay.
Which attaches the Canada logo on top. And I think that's important because that will become your vaccine passport. British Columbia is well recognized within Canada, but think about it for longer haul when you do decide to go and stray from the Canadian borders, let's say. But now you're heading your way to Edmonton. You want to give yourself an extra half hour if you're traveling. You want to be masked up. As I said, you want to probably try and reduce all the different touch points. So check in if you can at home. And if you're carrying bags, great, then reduce another checkpoint. But if you have a bag to check, you're going to have to go to the counters. The cleaning protocols at the airport they're going on all the time. We're electrostatic cleaning. We put HEPA filters in, the circulation in the building. We were actually recognized as the top hygiene measures in North America by Airport Councils International. And that really speaks to consumers' either awareness of what's expected of them and their comfort while actually in the airport and the quality and visibility of the cleaning routines. So we put a lot of effort into it. A lot of people are concerned about sort of air travel itself, but I can tell you that the circulation on an aircraft is like an operating room. It's 20 times an hour the air in the cabin circulates. It's typically 4 in a normal office building.
I think that's the core concern is once I'm in the airplane, I'm going to catch anything that's floating around.
So the incidence of any transmission for air travel is far less than the national averages. All the testing that have been done, even on international arrival points into airports like Toronto and Vancouver, the incidence of COVID detection is lower than the actual COVID penetration in the country that you followed. So it's not air travel, it's group contact are the biggest concerns, that kind of thing. So travel in and of itself is relatively safe It's what you do on either end of the
Okay.
trip
Yeah.
that creates risk. So be smart, follow safety protocols, and you'll be fine.
Geoff, one of the things that you touched on is taking these safety steps. And internationally, there's an additional step that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and a lot of tourism organizations would like to see stopped, which is this need for double vaccinated people who want to come back to the country have to have another COVID test before they're allowed to come. That's extra money. It's an extra step. It's an extra hassle. How do you feel about those tests? Do you think that's something the government can get past?
I think eventually they will. I think at a point you have to go, all right, everyone traveling is double vaccinated. How many more layers of risk mitigation do we need to attach? And I can understand them being somewhat conservative, but we're seeing that easing more and more in different countries, and just really focusing on full vaccination, and that being a high degree of comfort. So I think it'll come. It's difficult for me to sit here and tell the federal government from a science perspective what's the best path to go down, but I can tell you from a economic, constrainer perspective, if that's the way to say it, that it's reducing the amount of travel back and forth simply because it's an extra $250 cost on top of the trip.
It's a headache. It's a hassle too, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I'm always amazed at in the industry. Air Canada's come out with a kit that you can take with you. Then you could you can test remotely and have the results, so you don't have to worry about getting tested in the country that you're going to. And so, we'll see. The one thing I'm always encouraged about where industries or mankind is innovation and responding to the circumstances. So it always gives me inspiration and hope.
So, when people talk about airports, they generally think about just what we've been talking about, the flights. But there's so many economic connectors. The airport itself is a huge economic driver. Many folks don't get that. It's powering peninsula business from hospitality and hotels, transportation with the cabs and the buses, all of the ancillary services within the airport, all of the folks working, construction, building. It's so good to hear that you're starting to recover and get back to a semblance of where you are. But speak for us to the future of that and how have some of these businesses been impacted over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's been quite devastating. In terms of the economic impact of the airport, we had it measured, let's say 3 years ago, and it was $880 million in annual economic impact. So you're almost $1 billion. And so I've always contended that a vibrant airport is it's vital for a vibrant city. It's sort of a precursor. And I often sort of ask people to think back in terms of, various centuries and think of the importance of seaports and think of the importance of railway and railroad infrastructure. Think of the importance of highways and roads, and then just sort of look back in time and think of the importance, quite frankly, of airports today. And to me, it's the 21st century sort of key transportation provider. So there's so many businesses involved here, whether it's taxi cabs and people making a livelihood in that particular industry, car rental companies, restaurants and retail staff that are here. We have some 60 tenants around the airport, whether it's aircraft manufacturing or flying schools, or even distribution centers for food products, that it's all kind of linked. And the reason that they're locating out here is because they see it as somewhat of a logistics hub and big opportunities for growth. And one of the latest signals of that would be bringing Amazon onto a site as a tenant, who've seen that as a great opportunity for a last mile distribution center, build out our land revenue base to help us future-proof for revenue downturns going forward. And it's great that they've decided to come out and build on the peninsula.
Can I ask you very quickly about how bad things got and where we are today and where you hope to be in the very near future in terms of the amount of travel happening at the airport?
So when the pandemic was announced, memory serves me correctly, it was around the middle of March in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Our business went from 100 flights a day to 6, and our traffic volumes went from 6,000 people a day to about, I don't know, less than 200. So we were looking at around, I think 5%, or sorry, 2% was the kind of volumes and activity that we had, a decrease of 98%. And I can tell you, when you do hypothetical horrible scenarios in business planning as a CEO, you kind of model 10, 15, 25% declines.
Right.
25%, no way. And so here we are at 98%. We found it build back to about 30% last summer. And then the fourth wave came and we went back down to 10% for pretty much the first 6 months of 2021. Now we're sitting at around 60, 65% in terms of flights and people moving. I think it's going to stay that way through most of the winter. And I think we'll get back up to about 80, 85% throughout next summer. So 100% maybe 2023. Fingers crossed.
Great to hear the perspective of Geoff Dickson. And I'm excited that the Victoria Airport, Victoria International, is really getting back up on its feet. And, I think there's still a lot of caution about flying, and maybe some of that's been helped in this discussion. To be very, very frank, we've canceled a trip that we'd planned for Hawaii this winter. We're just not comfortable going to the United States on a big trip. You have to get these tests where you have to go in and get a test to show you don't have COVID when you go, and a test before you come back. And the tests are expensive. I believe it would have cost us an additional $800 to $900 just to do the tests. And on top of that, Americans, many of them are not vaccinated. I believe it's almost 90 million US citizens are not vaccinated, including on the islands of Hawaii. People are going into restaurants, people are going into public places. They're not necessarily wearing masks, and a lot of them aren't necessarily vaccinated. I'm just not prepared to take the chance yet. A lot of my friends are traveling south. I have friends that have gone to Palm Springs, other places in the States. No aspersions being cast. For me, I'm not comfortable, but I'm certainly prepared to travel across Canada, and it's no reflection on the Victoria Airport people. And I just wanted to bring up one other thing, John. We've had Gary Beyer on the show last week. Yeah. The guy who runs Tesseract Computers downtown.
Yeah. Great interview.
Great interview. And he made a point that's really caught some people's attention.
Yes.
People don't remember the fact that the business community, for the most part, in downtown Victoria, do not have a vote. Unless you own a building downtown, you can't vote for your business. A lot of business people who actually operate downtown don't live in the city of Victoria. They live in Saanich, they live in Oak Bay, Esquimalt, you name it, the West Shore. They don't have a voice. So it's a curious situation. And I'm glad Gary Beyer brought this up, because people should know the frustration of our business community.
It was fascinating, interesting how, first of all, Gary's comments have got a ton of attention. And lots of commentary on our social media platforms. And this issue of business people being unable to vote, who don't, that operate a business but don't live in Victoria, was quite startling to many. It's one of the realities of living in a small region with 13 municipalities. Most of these business owners live in different parts of Lower Vancouver Island. Oak Bay, Saanich, Esquimalt, the West Shore increasingly. And as you stated, unless they own the building where they operate, they can't vote in Victoria. And you and I have been around the chamber for quite some time. And this issue has been a priority issue for us since those days. This goes back quite a long way. And when you have councils that don't have business people on them, which is increasingly happening. It's tough to run a business and be involved in the community. then that voice is often not heard.
It's a gift that keeps on giving from former Municipal Affairs Minister Robin Blanco back in the 1990s when the business vote was removed from the table. No signs that it's coming back. And again, great to have Gary Byers' perspective. And you know, speaking of perspective, we've got a very hot guest coming up next week who has a lot of perspectives on a lot of things. The Mayor of Langford will be in the Rumble Room.
Oh, man, Stu and I go back quite a ways. Actually, before my time knowing him, he was in school with my wife. I'm not going to date any of us, but it was at Belmont. And so Stu and I have connections from quite a ways back. And
Stu Young is such a big personality, right?
Oh, huge. And there'll be tons of things to talk about, I assure you.
Well, that's great, John. I'm looking forward to having Stu Young on the show, and I'm looking forward now, as we wrap this up, to again hear your wonderful review of how people can subscribe and like and support the Rumble Room as we soldier on.
You know, Robin, we had Jamie Hammond on midsummer, perhaps. The amount of folks that are listening to our show since that time to today is literally a straight line up. I mean, we've gone from hundreds to tens of thousands of viewers. So clearly they're listening to this part where you can share the show. But
and they're watching it too.
Pardon me?
And they're watching it too.
And watching it too. It is a podcast after all, isn't it?
Just thought I'd mention that.
To how people can share it. I'm sort of perplexed at how recent issues have hit me emotionally. They're not just policy issues, they're ones that really touch me. And those, we've talked about them all today, one being Remembrance Day, my link back to my parents' heritage. This museum issue, we used to take our kids there. That's where we went all the time. I went through the boat and we went through the cobblestone area. I mean, wow, for that to be gone. And then on top of that, the third issue, just like within the last couple of days, within the past week, is this notion that there'll no longer be fireworks on July 1st during Canada Day. 3 big emotional issues this week. Whew, so I'm like, my heart's really thumping on so many ways. But anyway, we'll be talking about all these and the way that you folks can share in our experiences is through Facebook, VictoriaRumbleRoom.com. Lots of followers there. Lots of action on Twitter these days. Wow, that's just erupted with Twitter chatter. Like, how do you speak in 240 symbols or less? It's quite a skill set. All of our videos are housed on our YouTube site. We are on Instagram. I'm trying to build that following. So if you're there, definitely comment on our shows. And for those of you on TikTok, hop on board. It's a crazy world over there. And certainly not last but not least, the Tulip Avenue sensation today. Ending the show. My name is John Jurisic.
And I'm Robin Adair, and we will remember on the Rockin' Rumble Room Show.